reading today, the New Testament reading, is taken from 1 Peter, chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. This may be found in your pew Bibles on pages 1889 and 1890. Wives and husbands. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that, if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hopes in God used to make themselves beautiful. They were submissive to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters if you do what is right, and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
And our Old Testament reading this morning comes from the book of Esther, starting with chapter 1, verse 13, and going to verse 22. That can be found in your pew Bibles on page 776 and continuing to 777. Listen to the word of the Lord as it is read. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of the law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were the closest to the king: Karshina, Shethar, Admartha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the king or the commands of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, and not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the people of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day the Persians and the Median women of nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all of the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all of his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man shall be ruler over his own household. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And I'm sure there are a few of you who, just based on the readings of the Old and New Testament, already want to take and hang me from the highest rafter they can find. But please, give me the next 15 minutes to try to put this into some perspective that may be more tenable to you. Last week, we started our sermon series on the book of Esther, and when we started it, we looked at the fact that King Xerxes was holding a banquet that, when he got the bright idea that parading his beautiful wife, the queen, among a group of men who have spent 7 days drinking would be a good idea. Well, okay, maybe it wasn't so bright of an idea after all. Queen Vashti did not want to be part of this activity, and he informed the eunuchs who delivered the king's message to deliver a message back to the king. That message is, I'm not coming. Not surprisingly, the king was not pleased with the action of willful defiance that his wife took in the front of all the people of the capital city of Susa. As we resume the story in verse 13, we see Xerxes calling for the wise men who knew the time to advise him what to do. Now these wise men were astrologers who had gained the trust of the king to the point that these 7 advisors did not have to wait for an invite from the king to come to the king, nor did they have to wait for their arrival to be announced. They could just come and go and visit with the king anytime they wanted. Now, I find this situation that we're looking at to be an interesting one at best. We have the king of almost the entire known world at the time not being powerful enough to know how to deal with a wife who was disobeying him on his own. So his solution is to take what is basically a domestic squabble and turn it into a national issue. Unfortunately, his 7 advisors will end up giving him some bad advice, and as a result, they will reach a bad decision. Those of you who have worked with computer programming and computer languages are probably familiar with the acronym GIGO, G-I-G-O. It stands for garbage in, garbage out, and it basically states that if you put garbage information into the program, what you're going to get out as the result is going to be garbage as well. And King Xerxes is proving this point today. When we seek advice, we need to make sure that we are receiving good advice. And the best source of advice that I know of is Scripture. That is why it is important for us to be studying Scripture on a regular basis. When we are studying Scripture, we are getting the best advice we can receive. As we move on to verse 15, Xerxes reviews the facts of this case with his advisors, and then asks for a legal opinion as to what should be done. Memucan speaks and confirms for the king that indeed what Vashti has done was not only a personal insult to His Majesty, but it also resulted in great harm to the kingdom. The advisor's line of reasoning was that everyone in the kingdom will hear about this event, and as a result, the women throughout the kingdom will start rejecting their husband. Now remember, the kingdom that we're talking about spanned almost the entire known world at the time. While in the 21st century AD, we could see that it was maybe theoretically possible that somebody happened to have their cell phone on, turned on the video, and then after capturing the video of Vashti ignoring the king's order, posting it on social media, and in a matter of hours, the whole world now knows that the queen has disobeyed the king. But remember, we're not talking about a story that took place in the 21st century. We're talking about a story that took place in the 5th century BC, well before the age of 24/7 news stations, the internet, or any of our other modern technology that makes it possible to spread information, or for that matter, misinformation as well, instantly throughout the world. Memucan's advice should have been laughed out of Xerxes' court for even making such a ludicrous evaluation of the situation. However, one of the commentators suggested that perhaps the advice was being influenced because his wife happened to hear what Vashti said and did, and now Memucan is also dealing with this disobedient wife thing, so that it was in his own personal interest that the king makes this a big deal. In verse 19, we get to the actual suggestion of his advisor. And his suggestion was that the king should issue a royal decree that cannot be repealed, stating that Queen Vashti is never to enter into the presence of the king again. Our royal advisor continues by suggesting that the king give Vashti's position to someone more worthy than Vashti. Now, left unsaid, but probably pretty well understood, more worthy meant more obedient to the king. Furthermore, the king should declare that every man shall be ruler over his own household, and dispatches should be sent through every portion of his kingdom, written in every language that was spoken, informing his subjects of this decree. As we look at what advice Memucan gave, we can see that it was lacking any legal precedents being cited, as well as there was no current law being mentioned that would support the advisor's counsel. What the advisor was doing was giving nothing more than what he believed would be the best thing to do in this situation, not what the law stated. Like my sermon title this morning suggests, bad advice results in bad results. And we see that for whatever reason, the king and the rest of his advisors agreed that this bad idea actually seemed like a good one. Now let's take a quick review of what the results of such a decree would be. First of all, can anyone, by merely passing a law, mandate respect? Obviously not. After all, if merely passing a law was all that was needed to achieve a certain level of respect for one another, would we need law enforcement officers? No, because the law's written, if the law could mandate respect, we wouldn't need those law enforcement officers. One example that most of us have experienced personally that shows that laws do not automatically gain respect came in 1974 when President Richard Nixon signed into law a mandatory national speed limit of 55 miles an hour. I can tell you from firsthand accounts that in California, the law was pretty much universally ignored, and that included when there was a black and white right next to you. You were still going 60 or 65, and if you were doing 55, you might be pulled over for hindering the flow of traffic. In Wyoming, the state legislature passed a statute stating that driving over 55 miles an hour, but I believe it was as long as you were under 70, the highway patrol might pull you over, but they would cite you for wasting natural resources. That citation came with a $25 fine, and it was not a moving violation, so there was no point on your driving record, and your insurance company would be none the wiser. Basically, what Wyoming was doing, and I have to admit, when I talked to teens to confirm that my memory was right, I was impressed. Basically, what Wyoming was saying was, okay, federal government, you say that we have to enforce this law to get your highway money. We'll enforce the law, but while we're doing it, just thumb our nose at you too, because of course, that wasn't what the intent of the law was. And I have to admit, I do like the Wyoming legislature for this way of getting around federal regulations. Furthermore, as the years went on, compliance with this nationwide state law or speed law was such a fiasco that in 1987, Congress changed the speed limit from 55 to 65, hoping that would result in compliance. And then when they found that even the 65-mile-an-hour speed limit was being ignored, in 1995, Congress eventually outright repealed the national mandatory speed limit. I'm assuming that when Xerxes' edict reached all the points of their land, the law had the same effect on wives' behaviors as the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit had on our behavior of driving our vehicles. Another unintended consequence of this edict might be the fact that what the king feared the most, that the whole land would hear about it. Well, when you start passing an edict, that guarantees that what might have been a rumor at one point, oh, that rumor must be true because the king passed the edict saying that the husbands are the head of the household. I guess Vashti was a brave woman back then. So instead of having the result of enforcing compliance, it might have actually did more to hurt the respect that wives had for their husbands. While Xerxes was receiving some bad advice, our New Testament reading from 1 Peter had some good advice for us. Had the king had the advantage of having 1 Peter available to him back then, and then followed his advice in the book of Esther would have never been written because Vashti would have never had to defy the king. Now, husbands, I want to warn you, before you start elbowing your wife saying, pay attention to the pastor, and ladies, before you start labeling me a male chauvinist pig for even mentioning the first 6 verses of Peter, 1 Peter 3, I'm asking that you wait and you hear out my whole explanation. 1 Peter starts off by saying that wives are to be submissive to their husbands, and then points out that in so doing, those who were married to non-believers might win their non-believing husbands over to the Lord. Peter continues by saying that a wife's beauty should come from inside and not outside. So it's not the gold and the makeup and all the fancy clothes that makes a wife beautiful. It's what's inside of her. Now, I know many feminist groups object to Bible passages such as this one in 1 Peter, claiming that they do not bring honor to the wife. Many of you might remember a time way back when the standard vows of a bride at her wedding would be to love, honor, and obey. With the movement towards equal treatment of women, which started somewhere around the 1970s, many brides started to omit the vow to obey. When Emily and I were married in 1987, Emily decided to include the vow to obey in her wedding vows. And I remember at the reception after the ceremony, there were many in attendance, including my own grandmother, who expressed great surprise at the fact that Emily would include such an archaic vow in her wedding vows. However, I would argue those who object to such a vow are overlooking the last part of Peter's instructions. Notice that Peter tells husbands that in the same way that women are to be submissive to their husbands, the husbands are to be considerate to the wives and treat them with respect and as co-heirs to the gracious gift of life. And then Peter adds a promise. If we husbands treat our wives in such a manner, nothing will hinder our prayers. So husbands, if you think that you're having problems having God hear your prayers, one way of remedying that situation is to check out and see how you are treating your wives. And then perhaps that's the hindrance to your prayers. Paul, if we want to Paul's instructions to husbands, he is even more emphatic with his instructions to husbands, as it's found in the 5th chapter of Ephesians. In verse 26 of the 5th chapter of Ephesians, the apostle tells husbands to love their wives in the same way that Christ has loved his church and gave himself up for her. Now, I firmly believe that any wife who is married to a husband who loves her in the same way that Christ loved us, his church, will have no problem in obeying her husband because it would not be an onerous task to do so. So far in this story, we see King Xerxes making two major mistakes. His first mistake, which we saw last week, was that he commanded Vashti to do something that would prove to be degrading for her. As a result of Xerxes' inability to consider what was in the best interest of Queen Vashti, she was put in a very untenable position of having to disobey her husband. Then in today's passage, we see that the king makes a second mistake by listening to bad advice, and as a result, making a decision to ban Vashti from ever being in his presence again. One commentator that I read in preparation for this message this morning questioned whether banning Queen Vashti from ever being in the king's presence again was actually a punishment in Vashti's eyes. After all, the queen had already declared that she wants nothing to do with a husband/king who would make the command for her to appear before a large group of drunk men. While so far in the first 2 weeks we have not seen the title character of our story appear, that will change next week as we are introduced to Esther in the 2nd chapter. In the 2nd chapter, we start to see how God used this unfortunate incident between the king and queen to place in the royal palace a person who would be able to protect God's chosen people from the annihilation that one of the king's advisors was planning for them. As we close our study on chapter 1 of Esther, let us remember 3 things. First, like we learned last week, regardless of how things look like to us, God is working behind the scenes for the good of those of us who love Him. Next, it is important that when we are making decisions, it is based on solid advice. And we all know that the best source of advice comes from Scripture. Therefore, we should be studying the Bible on a regular basis and learning how to apply its advice. Finally, while the Bible clearly states, like Circe's decree, that the husband is the head of the household, that does not give us husbands carte blanche to do whatever we desire. The husband's authority is curbed by his obligation to treat his wife, as well as the rest of his household, with dignity, respect, and consideration. When the husbands are fulfilling their obligations, the rest fall into place automatically. However, when we husbands fail to fulfill our obligations, that is when we end up in a mess similar to what the king is facing in chapter 1 of the book of Esther. May God bless us and strengthen us to be faithful to His commands. Amen. I would now encourage you to stand if you're able and sing "O Worship the King," page 336.